economic liberalization works. Getting government out of the way works. Having a system where you don't need a permit from an official, often asking for a backhander, where you don't need a permit to do something, that is the secret to economic growth and success.
What makes some countries poor and others prosperous? I posed this question to Douglas Carswell, a former member of parliament in the United Kingdom and a one-time leader of the Brexit campaign. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation on my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. If you'd like to watch the full interview with Douglas Carswell, you can click on the link in the description below. Enjoy. And I wanted to try to understand your earlier problem that you framed, which was, why are some countries prosperous and others are poor? And what is the difference? Because it seems that all societies have this tension between this emergent order of progress and collaboration and people working together, but then these parasitic elites that also try to extract patronage or rents from productive people, or to entrench themselves in power. But in the United Kingdom, where you were, spent most of your life, for 800 years since the Magna Carta, there have been checks on the royal power, for example.
Yeah.
But in some societies, there's just elites or parasites run rampant. So why is there this difference in outcomes?
Well, let me answer that question by using a really good African example. And that, I think, is the example of a country I know well, Uganda, a country I once called home. When I was growing up in Uganda, it was dirt poor. The population would grow at maybe 2-3% a year, and the economy would certainly never grow that fast and would quite often actually decline in absolute terms. And so you saw visible poverty with your own eyes. You saw children with no shoes. You saw young babies with evidence of malnutrition, kwashiorkor. Life expectancy was 30-something and falling. It was a country that was returning to a state of absolute poverty. Today, Uganda is prosperous. It has a thriving middle class. Its GDP has been growing at an average of 5 or 6% a year now for nearly 25 years, which is the miracle of compound interest, quite a leap forward. And Uganda, I think, is a real model of how a successful African country can be run. Now, what is the difference? What is the difference between Uganda in the 70s and Uganda today? Trust me, the NGOs and the Western aid agencies would have you believe it's to do with them. It has got absolutely nothing to do with Western aid efforts. The real driver of human progress in Uganda is that there is no longer an attempt, or there's much less of an attempt, I should say, to order Ugandan society by blueprint and design. When the British pulled out of Uganda in the 60s, they did so by putting in place a state architecture that tried to order society by socialist design. So you had a coffee marketing board to control the buying and selling of coffee. You had cooperatives, and you had state regulation of agriculture. You had controls on imports and exports.
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
And then, of course, you had a monopoly currency that the president tended to use as his own personal piggy bank. Creating the administrative state that could try to order Ugandan society by blueprint was a disaster. It created a horrible system of price controls, import and export controls, high tariffs. It was a permission-based economy, and it fell apart. Uganda today is prospering because that simply doesn't happen anymore. You have digital disruption, which means that you as a Ugandan farmer with access to the internet, you can buy and sell from the cheapest buyer and seller anywhere in the world. You don't have to go through middlemen to get supplies from a producer in China. You've had this great liberalization of the economy. And if you go to Uganda today, everyone everywhere is hustling and running a business of some kind somewhere. You've had this great process of liberalization. Now, of course, you may have some parasitic vested interests in the administrative state there who do the things that corrupt elites have done throughout history, whether it's in Elizabethan England or 21st century Africa. But their ability to actually inhibit economic activity of the rest of their fellow Ugandans is far, far less than it ever was in the 70s. And this explains why a country like Uganda is growing. The reason why Uganda prospers is because the government doesn't attempt to control the economy the way they tried a generation ago. Now, to me, this is the blueprint for not just Africa, but for the whole world. I'm here in Mississippi, where there are some parts of the state where there's been no real increase in living standards in 30 years. Well, if Uganda can have 6% growth a year by liberalizing its economy, surely parts of the world, whether it's other parts of the world in Africa or in Mississippi, could learn from that. Economic liberalization works. Getting government out of the way works. Having a system where you don't need a permit from an official, often asking for a backhander, where you don't need a permit to do something, that is the secret to economic growth and success.
And Douglas, what do you think is the relationship between political freedom and economic freedom? Sometimes people tend to separate these two, particularly when China is being discussed. Yeah. So, well, no, the bureaucrats of the Chinese Communist Party, they are just engineering the economy and are driving towards very high levels of growth, and you don't need political freedom. What would you say to that argument? Medium
term, if you don't have political freedom, you won't have economic freedom. Now, you can find short-term exceptions to that rule, and China today, I would say, is an example of that. There's very little there's very little political freedom. In fact, there's a loss of political freedom, and you still see impressive increases in electricity consumption and energy production and GDP growth. But I think what we're seeing in China is actually a horrible proof of the fact that you cannot have sustained economic growth without political liberty, because I suspect China is actually reverting to its, what you might call its Ming tradition. It is denying people freedom. You now have an increasingly autocratic government in Beijing that is centralizing power. The autonomy that the different provinces enjoyed since the late 1970s is giving way to a much more central system of control. You're starting to see the Chinese political elite clamping down on the prosperous merchant class, what in Elizabethan England or early modern Holland would have been called the merchant class. You start to see people like Jack Ma clearly having to dance to the tune of the Communist Party apparatchiks. And I think this is pretty ominous for the future of China's economic and technological growth. If China continues to undo the liberalizing effects of Deng Xiaoping, if it continues to return to its Ming tradition, it will do what China has done spectacularly over the centuries, which is to not fulfill its huge potential. I think that if you don't have political liberalization in China, you will, I think, end up with a slow-growing, stagnant monolith. People often talk about the inevitability of China's rise. I think actually in 10, 20 years' time, China may look a little bit more Japanese than it does now. Japan was, of course, supposed to be the world's #1 economy by 2020. People talked about Japan overtaking the United States. Japan, having invented the Walkman, then went on a 30 to 40-year holiday from history in economic terms. I suspect China may do something similar if it doesn't liberalize. Centralization, the exercise of political power over the entrepreneurial class, it's all looking pretty ominous for China in terms of sustained economic growth. Innovation fundamentally depends upon chaos. It depends upon innovation. It depends upon people being able to come along and try different things that upset powerful vested interests. I think it's difficult to see how China that returns to its authoritarian Ming tradition will be able to continue to be as innovative as it looked to be for a fleeting moment. The nationalization or the state control of some of the big tech enterprises in China, I think, is a sign of things to come.
Yeah, and that is one of the criticisms of the Chinese model, is that it stifles innovation. I think one of the beauties of market-based economies is that there is a principle of permissionless innovation that occurs.
I mean, never forget that China invented the wheelbarrow, they invented compass, they invented gunpowder, they invented printing, they invented paper money. I mean, there's an incredibly long list of Chinese innovations, but it was Europeans who were able to utilize those inventions. And there's a reason for that. And that is because in China, historically, the people with power have prevented spontaneous order. They've prevented people from doing things differently. And I fear we're beginning to see a return to that in China now. I think all this bodes rather well, actually, for the long-term prospects of both India and the United States. Those are two giant economies that don't have this tradition of top-down autocratic regulation. I think if I was a betting man, you never get rich by betting against the United States. And I think India, with its rather more chaotic model, is probably a long-term better bet, precisely because it's a parliamentary democracy, a long-term better bet than China.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this discussion, you might want to check out the full conversation with Douglas Carswell. That's linked over here. I'd also be grateful if you could subscribe to my other channel. That's linked over here. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And until next time, take care.